COVID-19 is moving at lightning speed and with a distinctly uncertain trajectory. So today felt like and feels like a timely session. Obviously, the challenges for organisations, both reputational and operational, regardless of their size or sector, could be considerable. And one of our key points is that the collective response to this uncertainty needs to be calm, needs to be proportionate and evidence-based, with communication playing a fundamental role in ensuring that that's the case. So in today's session, we're going to examine the crisis communication key principles and the crisis preparedness best practices that you might consider either for your own organisation or for those that you advise. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a reminder of a definition of what a crisis actually is and look at some of the macro and micro risks that the potential spread of the virus might entail. We're then going to look at the crucial dovetail between communication and operational preparedness. And we're going to touch on issues ranging from systematic risk assessment and scenario planning through to providing psychological safety. Overall, we hope that today will take you through the areas that you need to think about to ensure both human preparedness and organisational resilience. And we're going to conclude with questions, but please feel free to post your questions, as Imana said, in the chat function. We're going to pause for breath halfway through and take some questions and then continue with the presentation itself. First of all, just to introduce us, for those that don't know us, I'm Rod Cartwright. I'm a senior advisor specialising in issues management, crisis communication, corporate reputation, and leadership communication. The consultancy I founded late last year has a mission of delivering human preparedness and organisational resilience so that no leader is left unprepared. Just by way of background, over the past 25 years, I've held leadership positions in international agencies, including Text 100, Ketchum, H&K and GCI, delivering reputational preparedness and live crisis counsel across multiple industries. Perhaps most notably, I was part of a team that advised the CEO, chair and board of Malaysia Airlines following the tragic disappearance of flight MH370 and then on the subsequent restructuring of the airline. So that's me. Matt, over to you for a little introduction.
Okay, hi everybody. So I'm Matt Hodges-Long. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Continuity Partner, and that's a business of two parts. The first one is providing managed business continuity and resilience services to companies as a managed service provider. So typically companies anywhere from about 50 staff up to about 3,000 or 4,000. Across a range of different market industries. And then the other part of the company that's born out of that is a software platform called Track My Risks, which is a governance, risk and compliance management tool, software as a service tool. And that's deployed at the moment to just over 4,000 end user customer companies to help them stay on the correct side of the law. So in relation to this conversation, you know, I've got a lot of experience in a number of sectors, but including construction, pharmaceuticals, property industry, sort of high hazard industries for a number of reasons. And in terms of sort of direct crisis management activity, apart from working with clients on various reputational issues and physical issues that they've had. Some of the big ones that are very noteworthy was I was deeply involved in the recovery after Hurricane Sandy a few years ago, and also the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombings, which were sort of, you know, those wide scale, citywide, sort of area wide events where most of the established rules of how to do things needed to be ripped up and rethought dynamically. So that's really my background to this, and glad to be here.
Matt, thank you so much. So let's dive straight in. Before we get into the question of the key principles and best practices I mentioned, we wanted to start by revisiting the whole notion of crisis and what the definition of a crisis is in the true sense. Because as you'll see, this is critical both in terms of your mindset and your practical approach to COVID-19, particularly when we remember how much the true definition of crisis differs from the widespread use of the word. So that's Matt and I, obviously. If you were to stop the woman or man in the street and ask them to tell you what they thought a crisis was, then this is what they'd probably come up with. Words like disaster, catastrophe, cataclysm, the end of the world. Because after all, this is what our public discourse and media have tended to use in throwing the word crisis around a little bit like confetti. Matt?
Yeah, so I think where that breaks down into, actually, we just sort of grabbed some headlines here from the last few days, and I think, you know, if I'd have done this again this morning, I probably could have swapped a whole load more. And these are some of the more sensible, reliable headlines. But we can just see how the whole media is fueling the fire, if you like, in relation to COVID-19. But I won't say which one, but one of these headlines relates to one of my clients, but we'll leave everyone guessing on that. But this gives you an idea of how topical this story is at the moment. So.
Yeah, and as Matt says, the extent to which the media and public discourse underlines that notion of crisis as catastrophe or disaster. But if we actually look back at crisis properly defined, the word crisis actually comes from a Greek word, krisis, which interestingly and ironically means the turning point in a disease which decides whether the person with the disease gets better or gets worse. In other words, a crisis is a critical moment. It's an inflection point rather than a disastrous endpoint. And of course, the irony is not lost on us that the word that we use so widely comes from the Greek relating to a disease. If you look at the Chinese character for crisis, consists of the characters for risk and opportunity. And we're not sharing this for some intellectual love of semantics, some adoration of obscure etymology. It's because this definition of crisis, and there's no question that COVID-19 qualifies, is absolutely critical in defining how you approach this particular issue attitudinally and practically, not as an automatic disaster, but as an inflection point or a turning point.
Okay, so to prove that point and build on it a bit further, that a major study of several hundred mass fatality events by Stephen Knight and Deborah Pretty at Oxford Metrica underlined the fact that the difference between handling a crisis well, being additive to brand equity and stock value, and then the inverse of that, handling it badly. So the starting point really is to ask you to consider this core definition of a crisis and how different it is from how we use the word in our discourse. But we can all think of our own examples of where a crisis has been handled well or badly. If we start with the bad example, if we think back to the BP Macondo Deepwater Horizon incident in April 2010, we had a quick look at the share price performance. So without grinding through exactly what went well and what didn't, it wasn't well handled, I think we'd all agree. Their share price just before that incident in April 2010 was at £6.39 a share. Within a couple of weeks or months of the incident, that dropped down to £3.04. And it's only ever peaked at £5.67. So its peak in the 10 years since the incident, or the 9 and a bit years since the incident, it's never recovered to where it was before the event, even though the passage of time has moved on for nearly 10 years. So then on the positive side, which I think Rod wants to jump in on, he wants to talk about chicken. So I'll leave that with him.
Yeah, not chicken per se, and this is a well-trodden case study. But I think, you know, if you've ever been to a conference in the last couple of years about crisis, the notion of how KFC handled its chicken shortage is copybook, in the sense of very boldly and bravely taking the KFC brand with the very striking image where the KFC had become FCK. They used the word that lawyers hate in a crisis, which was sorry. And they backed that up with all their socials. And looking at the Yum share price, which is the parent, negligible, if any, immediate impact. And in fact, the share price and also KFC's measured brand equity actually increased. So this notion that while one would assume correctly that a crisis handled badly will damage both brand equity and stock price, you can actually see that a crisis well handled can be additive to both. Because at the end of the day, for investors and others, there is no better way of testing the mettle of your leadership team, your organizational culture, your crisis plans, and your structure than putting those things through the stress test of a true crisis. So, moving on.
Okay, yeah, so it's important. We've talked a bit about what today is about. What it's not about is giving you the latest blow-by-blow account of what's going on with COVID-19 around the world. You know, everybody can read and take their own information on that. And it's not about specific decision-making processes. What we really want to talk about is, because every case is different, it's more about the principle of what crisis communications and crisis preparedness activity should you be doing in accordance with best practice, and how to embed that within your organizations and within your clients. So we hope that's helpful. We can take some specific questions in the question panel, and we might have to sort of defer on some of those, but throw them at us if there's anything that we're not covering. But really that's more about sort of setting the ground rules for today. So before we dive into all of those principles and best practices, we wanted to take a brief look at what we're calling the macro risks to society at the moment, and then the micro risks that are facing organizations. So if we start with the macro side of things, we've put those into three broad categories. That's economic, so looking at the negative impacts on the economic activity and growth, slowing of international travel and trade, sustained stock market falls, and the risk of tipping into recession. So really big sort of deep and dark stuff that are globally possible, and some of that's playing out now. There's the corporate macro risk, which is around the pressure on corporate profitability, investment, and the general squeeze on liquidity within companies, and that will vary from size to size of company. And then the societal risks around the widening of income inequality. So we've already got gig economy workers, for example, but we can look country to country, we can look regionally, globally. Strains on the healthcare systems, which are quite vulnerable in many countries, and then the overall sort of threat to social cohesion as a result of this. So there's sort of the big macro things. There is the overarching psychological impact of fear and uncertainty, which really is a major focus for us today, but it talks more about where I work day to day in the micro side of the equation. I've broken those down into 5 headings, and I won't run through all of them, but I'll give you a flavour of things to think about. So we tend to look at people, property, systems, suppliers, and financial as sort of micro risk categories. And then so within people, think about reduced or a distracted workforce, communication challenges between colleagues, and then travel restrictions, whether that's going into work or traveling for work, are all things that affect the people. On the property side, we've got things like denial of access, closing for a deep clean. What are we doing with meetings and events, and how does that impact our business? Systems, not a lot of people think about this in relation because systems don't generally get COVID-19, but think about excess load from remote access. If you suddenly start moving all of your staff home and just say to them work from home, that does bring in IT challenges in terms of remote access. What devices are going to be people going to work from, and how does that fit with their information security posture? So there are lots of downstream activities from these mitigations and considerations. Suppliers, import disruption, supplier failure or shutdown, you know, the closing for cleaning or reduced hours, or actually just failing as businesses, and their insolvency. So there's lots of supply chain risks to think about. And then on the financial side, we've got reduced or delayed billing from our side, but then we've also got from the other side customer non-payment, either can't pay or won't pay as a result of the COVID-19 issues. And then we've got the increased costs of working. So if we are getting people to work from home, or we're putting on extra transport, and we're doing lots of other mitigation activities, then these could well be expensive, and many companies won't be able to afford to actually fund a continued period of time where they're having to implement additional costs. So you'll probably recognize many of those instinctively from your own businesses and the media coverage that's playing out. But if we're going to deliver a proper risk assessment and put in place scenario planning for preparedness, we do need to think in this systematic, granular way about the types of risks that we're going to need to manage. And we'll see that in more detail a little bit later on.
Brilliant, thank you, Matt. And we're going to pause here just to see what questions were coming over the transom, so just answer any of those. So just having a look for questions. Iman, have you got any that you wanted to flag to us, if possible? Anything come in?
Nothing just yet.
The odds of 52 PR and operations people not having any questions are almost impossibly small. So yeah, do send them in when you're able. So we'll crack on for now then. So having looked at those risks, let's now look at the principles and best practices which should inform how you handle any crisis, but which obviously we've looked at through the specific lens of COVID-19. And I think the starting point is that crises of whatever kind are essentially human issues that have human consequences and therefore require human decision making and a human response. And I am purposefully belaboring that point because one of the things that we will look at later is the relationship between system and process on the one hand and human readiness on the other. And as I say, attitudinally and practical, the process of humanizing your approach to crisis preparedness and crisis comms is critical. And in particular, to a practical point, as much as system and process is valuable, making sure that your plans are put through the ropes in terms of crisis comms training and simulation stress testing are every bit as essential to that process of humanization as the processes, systems and protocols. I work very closely with an organization called Polpio, who do remarkable social media-based crisis simulations, and I've worked with them all over the world. And the stress test of putting your team and your plans through a live simulation cannot be underestimated. I think operationally, teams, when they do overall crisis drills, tend to focus on physical incidents, around recovering workspace or data, but they tend not to look at the arrest of a CEO or the rumour and reality of a COVID-19 outbreak. And we're going to look at that dovetail between operational and communication preparedness in a little while. To continue that theme, if you think about it, organizations don't exist. They're really just an amalgam of people. And that means that true organization resilience is only made possible by focusing on personal human preparedness at a team and individual level. An army is only as good as its units, its divisions, and the way in which they're organized and coordinated. And so individually and collectively, this is what you need to do to make sure that your approach to organization resilience starts at an individual and team level in a very human way. Because at the end of the day, private and public sector organizations are no different, which makes this notion of human preparedness, psychological security, which we'll come on to, training and morale, absolutely mission critical. And talking to Matt about the operational side of things, his experience is that staff will look after themselves and their families first in a crisis such as an acute spread of COVID-19. And only when this is done will they then support their employer. This is basic human psychology of defend and protect yourself and those closest to you. And most business continuity plans don't take this dynamic into account. And as such, this means that in a major incident, those plans don't necessarily perform well. And Hurricane Sandy was a great example of that. You know, people that work days are unlikely to work nights for 3 weeks in a row, especially when that involves being in a cupboard 2 hours from home by minibus. So to that point about psychological safety, fear and uncertainty in a global pandemic, should that be declared, can be as damaging as the actual physical and health risks themselves, whether it's for your employees, your customers, suppliers, communities, or investors. And the words of Franklin D. Roosevelt, US President, feel particularly evergreen and fitting here. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And a fundamental challenge for any business in its preparations will be facilitating and nurturing what we're calling psychological safety, both inside and out. And if you Google anything off the back of this session, it's the term catastrophization. It's a term in psychology that basically means overestimating the scale, the magnitude, and the consequences of a perceived threat, and underestimating the resources available to deal with it. And this does absolutely not mean sticking your head in the sand, far from it. But it does, if you like, behoove every organisation to consider how to avoid this very human tendency to catastrophise at a corporate level in a way that also helps employees, customers, suppliers, communities, and investors to avoid falling into the same malaise. So that notion of psychological safety and security is absolutely critical in how you think about preparations. From an operational perspective, you know, COVID-19 is frightening for individuals and for entities, particularly when the trajectory is uncertain. So acknowledging that fact, taking advice, preparing and communicating what you are doing and what you're going to do is crucial. And remembering, and any good corporate communicator will know this, that at all times your actions, what you do, speaks every bit as loudly as your words, if not louder. Because ultimately, and I suspect Matt and I may be the only people on this webinar old enough to remember this rather wonderful strapline from the insurance company that became Aviva in the 90s. They ran a rather wonderful campaign around the theme, "We won't make a drama out of a crisis." So remembering the crisis as an inflection point, not a disaster. Part of your role as communicators and leaders is to avoid taking a crisis and turning it into a drama. Matt.
Yeah, so I think building on Rod's points of using objective data, there's a lot being spoken at the moment about COVID-19, but actually really what we should be doing is focusing all the time on making sure that we're using verifiable information. So World Health Organization, Public Health England are being highly proactive in their communication as a sounding board. But if you're going to provide any information that's third hand, make sure that the information is from verifiable sources. But you could do worse than ensuring all audiences for whom you are responsible have these resources bookmarked and ready for people to refresh as regularly as they wash their hands. So that's the key thing, is making sure that you're keeping up to date with the information. And then if you also look at how some of the key social platforms are approaching COVID-19, so Twitter put out a policy this morning ensuring the dissemination of reliable, authoritative information. Whether that's actually happening or not is moot, but you know, they are trying to lead in this regard. So if you can just go on to the next slide, Rod, as you're driving. Thank you. So it's key to remember that few PR crises are due to poor communication alone. It certainly contributes, but most reputational crises tend to involve some combination of product, operational, customer, structural, leadership, governance, cultural, political and regulatory issues. It's normally the conflation of many of those things that cause the problem. But from an operational preparedness perspective, business continuity planning and crisis communication preparedness simply have to work together in lockstep. So often I find that operational teams are slow or actually ill-equipped to report an operational or behavioural problem that could lead on to becoming a PR crisis. As an operational person myself, it tends to be by our nature that we're problem solvers, and we do tend to say that we can deal with this, we can, and back to Rod's earlier point of underestimating the potential interest in the story. So we tend to step up and say, we'll deal with it, we'll solve the problem. And actually we do need to be looking at communicating more quickly and more effectively with our comms colleagues, because that precious time that's lost due to the reluctance to report and managing the reputational risk increases with every hour that passes. So we need to get a move on and make sure that we alert as quickly as we can. So when we look at risk assessment and scenario planning, none of us can actually see into the future, or I certainly can't, but we can prepare for foreseeable reputational risks. So even with something like a coronavirus. So in preparing for and managing any crisis, systematic risk assessment, prioritization and planning are as crucial to reputational preparedness as they are to business continuity. So we're not wasting time with doing that. So we often use the macro and micro approach to this process at an organizational level in developing fully informed crisis comms plans and materials likely to withstand contact with the enemy. We do need some flexibility and dynamism in our approach, so we can't be too templated. So reviewing negative and damaging media attention that has affected other businesses in recent months or years, and cross-checking how your organization would respond to a similar set of circumstances can be really useful. So whether that's a product recall, pandemic, cyber attack, a fraud, can be a really powerful way of picking up the most likely scenarios and then go on to exercise them. So use someone else's misfortune to help you. And given the array of technological platforms able to support this, so something like NewsWhip is a prime example, there's no excuse for being caught short through a lack of preparation. You just need to put the time aside to make it happen.
Matt, thank you. So now we all know this intuitively, but the combination of social media, the 24/7 news cycle, the increasing empowerment of employees has essentially blown away the walls between internal and external. And how you prepare reputationally and operationally has to reflect the disappearance of these boundaries. Certainly in my experience, both from a preparatory and activation perspective, internal audiences are often, far too often, left behind almost as an afterthought or ignored altogether as organizations scramble, if you like, to manage what they perceive to be the more acute external risks. Because if you think about it, employee ambassadors and frontline staff are absolutely critical to brand perceptions and the customer experience. But an even more fundamental, for anyone knows the service profit chain idea from the Harvard Business School, we know that organizations don't exist without their people. And this means that internal communication and employee engagement are absolutely critical, particularly if remote working becomes as widespread as some are predicting. And I think there's been some very good coverage of these debates around the critical role of internal comms and employee engagement by Maya and the team at Holmes Report, now Provoke Media, who've run some very good pieces recently on that central role for internal comms in mitigating the risks posed by COVID-19. And obviously, central to this are clear social media policies, both for peacetime and crisis situations, and making sure that they're properly embedded, as well as making sure that you have actually done the crisis simulations with that large social media component to make sure that these have been fully tested. We all know, after all, that no crisis in the last 10 years has ever been properly broken by the mainstream media. And this means that, suspending scheduled posts, black site preparedness is all, dark side preparedness is all utterly indispensable. And to make that point about where risk lies, in the teeth of a crisis, people can often feel that the media are your most daunting foe. But from long experience and all the analysis, the greatest source of reputational risk is really an inconsistency of communication and message across all of your audiences and all of your channels. And with the potential of office closures, travel bans, and event cancellations, I actually think it's possible that they will become so widespread that we'll see, if you like, a neutralizing of how media coverage covers how individuals make organizations, how organizations make decisions of this kind in ways that you would normally not see in peacetime. And I think one of the key considerations is that in making and communicating operational decisions, be it to close an office, ban or limit travel, cancel events, or introduce home working policies, you need to really think about whether making moves like that based on the precautionary principle are properly balanced with the cost-benefit analysis of doing so. Because at the end of the day, as long as you're clear, simple, consistent, and human in how you communicate those decisions, the vast majority of your audiences will be understanding if they are properly and calmly explained. So I think avoiding being sucked into the potential groupthink that event cancellations, office closures, and home working are the automatic response is a really important thing to consider operationally and from a communication perspective. And equally, I think people can smell, if you like, an off-the-shelf crisis response from 100 yards. So what you actually make sure needs to happen is that your reputational preparation must ensure that your response to an issue or a crisis genuinely reflects your brand, your purpose, and your values. And as anyone who's seen the work that I do in crisis and my writing on it, to remind you that crises are ultimately human events with human consequences, which require human decision-making and human communication, which means that honesty, transparency, clarity, consistency, and above all else, truly human tonality will become more essential than ever to ensure that people trust your brand, the organization behind it, and your leadership. And operationally, your response also needs to be commensurate with the size of the business. People's expectations and judgment of how a major MNC responds are very different from those for a 3-person startup. Having said that, our sense is that many medium-sized or even large companies are not fully prepared and will therefore risk behaving like a startup. So whether you work for or advise an SME or a mid-cap, or indeed a large listed organization, you need to think about how you're responding in relation to your size and making sure that it measures up to people's expectations.
Okay, so with an issue such as COVID-19 to deal with, your employees, customers, investors, suppliers, everybody around you, the important thing to remember is that they'll just be just as uncertain and probably potentially as unprepared as you. So we're all in this together. It's affecting everybody. It's not a specific company issue. It's a societal macro issue. So being able to show, though, that you're prepared on all fronts is critical to minimizing uncertainty and business risk across your supply chain. So again, if we start thinking of herd immunity, let's try and get everybody to upskill slightly and get ready. So, but it does become very important in a hyper-competitive environment which we live in today. So that's pretty much every industry. And if you fail, if you're one of the companies that fails to adhere to some of these basic principles and best practices, it does leave a space into which your competitors could willingly jump. So there is a commercial risk there as well in terms of the long-term, how this plays out. So really what we're saying is that the best thing to do is to plan, monitor and respond in any crisis. And with COVID-19 in particular, the key will be to prepare for an outbreak within your business, exercise it and hope for the best you never need to implement. So that's really important takeaway. So we have some questions if Rod can go on. So we came up with 4 key questions for the audience, or for you to think about and take away and take within your own businesses. So the first 2 are mine. So the first one is open question: how productive will your business be if it's impacted by COVID-19? It's a broad question, but what will you no longer be able to deliver? What will your productivity reduce by? How will you be impacted? Open question. And then the second question that goes alongside that is, when the productivity drops, and I say that you will get a drop off in productivity, which of your customers are you going to let down and why? Or are you going to let them all down by a slightly smaller degree? So how will you actually triage the customer delivery, and how will you make that decision about who to say no to or to delay? And my advice would be, have that conversation before the event rather than in real time. So then, and Rod's got to come from a comms perspective.
Yeah, and I think in line with what we've said earlier on is, first of all, do you have a workable crisis comms plan? By workable, I don't mean a manual, an escalation process, a decision tree, and a set of template materials alone. That is your starting point only. A workable plan is one that has been properly embedded in the organization at both an executive and a communications level, as well as other parts of the system, including strategy, legal, marketing, and HR. And have you stress tested it? Because every single crisis simulation that I've done, you find that while the systems and processes look good, when put through the rigor of a proper simulation, you realize that they fall short, not because the plans per se are flawed, but because plans are delivered by our friends, human beings, people. And it's the fallibility of individuals and teams that needs to be tested out and modified, not just the comms plan itself. And to that point, are you balancing your systems and your processes and your infrastructure with a truly human approach that takes into account people's fear, uncertainty, tendency to catastrophize, and therefore all the implications for employee engagement, productivity, and therefore ultimately customer service, whether your business is a product-based organization or a service one, be it B2B or B2C. And actually, it's interesting, we've got a great question through from Katie, which I'll take on, and Matt, please pile on. So the question from Katie is: we have social and healthcare facilities on site for our charity. Some of our staff, due to their contracts, don't get sick pay due to their probationary period or their contract. So what's the most effective way to communicate with HR, perhaps to be more flexible on paying staff so that their psychological and financial safety is met? And I think there are a couple of thoughts, and then I'll hand over to Matt. I think this has already been recognised, in principle at least, in the government's own approach to COVID-19 yesterday. So they are at the moment calling on employers and considering legislation potentially to deal with this. But in a gig economy, when people are on short-term or 0 hours contracts, that you need to stop and go, what is the trade-off between holding someone to the letter of their contract and what that will mean for their psychological safety, their sense of engagement, their willingness to be productive, and therefore ultimately the ability of the organization to deliver effectively. So in a way, there is a selfless human response, I think, Katie, to your question, which is, how do you treat people as decent human beings? And then if you wish to be hard-nosed and selfish, the same question applies, because if you don't do that, then engagement, productivity, and service delivery are likely to taper off. Matt, I don't know if you've got thoughts on that question.
Yeah, I think I'd look at it and sort of speaking with HR and saying, you know, if some of those people are at the start of the cycle and we're going to get them back in 14 days back into the business, there may well be people later on in the cycle that will then be disappearing off, and we need to backfill them. And if we've actually abused all of our 0 hours contract staff at the start, what's the likelihood that they're going to come back and then be productive when we need them in 2 or 3 weeks' time? So I think it's having that sort of focused conversation with HR and actually understanding what those people do, what the critical roles are from a process perspective, and just pointing out to them that, you know, we need to maybe have some exceptional rules at the moment for this outbreak to make sure that we all come out of the other, you know, come out of it at the other end with a business that's intact.
Terrific, Matt, thank you. So we've got a good 15 minutes left for questions. I'm very conscious we have purposefully covered a lot of ground, and I think that the value of having the recording is it allows you to go back and consider calmly, with the time that you have available, all the things that we've covered. But we'd love to take any more questions that you have at this stage on what's clearly a hugely important topic.
I've got one that's just come in from Mark saying, how do you know what might break in a complex business? So I'm assuming there that's what, when you reduce, you know, if we look at some of those micro risks, when we knock out a building or we knock out 25% of our workforce, what's going to break, and, you know, how in a complex business, how do we know this? What I would say to that is that most department heads will understand what is critical in terms of resource to them to run their part of the business. So in an ideal world, you would have gone around and spoken to all of those department heads and said, what do you do in your department? What's critical within the business, and actually understand the process and have all of this mapped, which is what we do in our business for customers. But it's difficult to do that if you're in the midst of a crisis. So really just a quick one at the moment, Mark, would be to go around and actually have a quick conversation with the key department heads and ask them, what are they doing to plan? How are they expecting to work with a reduced workforce? And where are they worried? Where are their concerns? And then I think if that's quickly sketched out and sketched down, we can start to create some better planning and understand where that might impact on customers, how it maps to SLAs, and where the, you know, in a non-commercial business, maybe where the press attention is going to come from in terms of critical services either stopping or being reduced.
Yeah, and I just add, Matt, that, you know, this is why the process of scenario and risk planning is not only an operational thing. I mean, the way that I run crisis preparation, at its heart, rests on properly identifying with the leadership team what the macro risks are, and we use a sort of voting up workshop to decide where the greatest, broadest categories of risk come, and then within those prioritized categories, working out what the micro risks are and prioritizing them. Because otherwise, when you pull your manual and your template materials together, you're simply putting a sort of instinctive finger in the air. Your crisis comms preparedness has to be fundamentally risk linked to business and operational risk, rather than sitting in isolation as if the business were merely a press office, if that makes sense.
So we've got another question that's just come in from Callum, saying, how should we best maintain the sense of organisation with our teams if we do have to implement home working? Maybe that's one for you, Rod.
I think it's both. I mean, I think that the starting point is that this shouldn't be your starting point. I mean, you obviously should have a communications element to your home working policies. I think what it does mean, and this applies whether or not your staff are on site in an office or a factory or another building, is to work out how do you balance, if you like, the written word, whether that's by email or Slack or Teams or whatever your chosen internal comms platform is, with video-based content that reminds people they are part of a human organisation, and using video in a way that underlines that. Because I think if you merely rely on the written word and the very good technological channels, you run the risk of people feeling dehumanized and even more isolated than they are already. And then the second point is, obviously, as far as possible, making people feel, whether it's through the line management system or through your existing internal comms channels, that they have some skin in this game, that the way in which the organization moves forward reflects their views and their ideas, as opposed to that being imposed top down from the leadership. So the notion of dialogue-based employee engagement is really crucial. Matt, I don't know if you have any more operational thoughts.
Yeah, we've got some clients at the moment that, despite us talking about this for a long time, have ignored it, but have now adopted it, where, for example, they've finally got all of their staff onto a text messaging platform so they can send out messages from the CEO. A lot of them are adopting a sort of a morning stand-up meeting with teams. We do that within our business with our development team, where we have a morning stand-up call, which is 15, 20 minutes, just everybody jumps on Slack. And we have a sort of a quick discussion about the day's work ahead and a little bit of chit chat, and then everybody goes away to do their tasks and then talks on an ad hoc basis through the day. So it's just keeping people close. And I think it's understanding psychologically for companies that are used to all convening around a real water cooler at the office, for example, that there is a very high level of isolation when you move those people to remote working. For us in our business, we all work remotely anyway, so this is normal for us. But if you do all go to the same office every day and you see your colleagues and all of that communication is informal, you need to learn how to behave in a slightly different way. So it would be good to practice that ahead of time, or at least have a conversation with colleagues about how to do it.
Yeah, and Matt, to your point, I think it also makes the relationship between the comms function and human resources absolutely vital, because the idea that the leadership team says to comms, right, keep our people happy, or says to HR, right, you guys are all about talent and human resources sorted out, it has to work hand in glove. And I think the relationship between HR and comms will be more critical wherever COVID-19 goes than it is normally.
Yeah, I mean, this really ties in with the next question, which is from Darren, where he says, how do you keep a sense of perspective with internal comms when your workforce are seeing daily news feeds online telling them the situation looks much worse? So I think that's a really great point about the perspective there. And I think probably, Rod, that's probably more you, really, in terms of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in a way, it's why we've put the simple human psychology of this front and center, because, you know, if you remember that definition of catastrophization as overestimating threat and underestimating resources to deal with it, then you can help on both sides. There's everyone. I mean, in meeting rooms, in offices, on trains, no one is talking about anything else other than that, driven predominantly by the media. So your role as a business in being an arbiter of and conduit to really good authoritative information in a way that helps take the relative heat out of that media coverage, and then calmly through your comms and your operations, reminding people the degree to which operationally the resources are there to keep them protected, to keep them safe as far as possible, keep them engaged and keep them productive. So I think thinking of things through that prism of helping to reduce that fear and helping to reassure, those two sides of the equation are absolutely critical.
Yeah, I think from what we've seen with clients is there is a need to communicate, and I think the communication is one of, as an organization, we are taking this very seriously. We are monitoring it constantly. We are double checking and triple checking the information that we receive, and we will take the right actions to look after our staff. And I think quite often some people will just be very reassured by that, you know, the powers that be are keeping an eye on them and are looking after them, and then try to sort of mute this out. And I did mention earlier around the distraction of a workforce. I think we're already seeing a significant amount of distraction within organizations, and I think some of that is needed, and then some of it is just not helpful. But the reality is that this is dominating the news agenda and probably won't disappear for a while. And what we've got to be really careful of is that people don't just get fatigue over it and just ignore it in the end, and a bit like the sort of the Brexit fatigue in the run up to the election, just get it over with. I think we need to make sure that we're making the right calls and we're not over communicating as well and adding to the sense of worry. But we do need to be responsive and have a task force looking at this and making sure that there is sort of regular communication at a sort of crisis management level within the organisation.
Yep, nothing to add there. Are there any further questions, Matt?
No, I've got nothing else coming in at the moment, and I think we're getting towards our witching hour for having to finish the webinar. So unless anyone else has got any questions quickly, I think we probably need to get wrapped up, and you can maybe finish off, Rod.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the final thing to say is that the reason why we purposefully said what we would not and frankly could not do is answer the very organisationally specific questions of, should we introduce a remote working policy? Should we cancel our own events? Should we ban travel to other people's events? Should we ban travel to other parts of the world? You know, the list goes on. And I think that, you know, what we're here to do is to help you, as we've started to do today, think through and think around the challenges that you face in relation to your reputational and communication preparedness, the whole question of business continuity and business as usual risk mitigation, active crisis response, because as important as preparedness is, ultimately you have to act on it. And then if the worst happens, reputational brand and recovery. So you know, we could barely scratch the surface, but as we said at the very beginning, what we've tried to do is to provide you with a grounding in the notion of crisis as an inflection point, not a disaster, in some of those key principles fundamentally based around psychological safety and being human, in a way that touches both your operational and your communications preparedness and response. So it goes without saying, if you have specific questions, all of our details are there. Just ping us with your thoughts and any questions and needs that you have. Thank you so much. It's been a very well-attended webinar, unsurprisingly, given the topic. We hope that what we've said and shown you has been helpful, both in terms of your attitudinal approach and your practical approach. A big thank you to PRCA for setting this up at such short notice. We may, as yet, Iman, I'm not speaking for you, possibly rerun this on the basis that there's been huge demand for people who couldn't make today's session. But as Iman says, there will be a recording available for 3 days, and you know where we are. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to the PRCA. And as they used to say on NYPD Blue, be safe out there and take care of each other. So thanks for your time and your attention.